Hi, everyone. My name is Haley Rockenbach. I am the Senior Associate of SNAP Employment and Training at the National Community Action Partnership. So excited to be here today and having SJI present this wonderful presentation. We'd like to start off every meeting with the promise of community action. So I will read it aloud, read it with me. The promise of community action. Community action changes people's lives, embodies the spirit of hope, improves communities, and makes America a better place to live. We care about the entire community and we are dedicated to helping people help themselves and each other. Really just like to kick off with that message, I think, and carry it on to the rest of our webinar today. So with that being said, Bree and Eileen, you can take it away.
Great. Thanks so much, Haley. All right. Well, hi, everyone, and welcome. We're so glad to see all of you today to talk about centering participant voices in assessing your impact. We have a lot to share, and we're excited to hear from you as well. So we're looking forward to our time with you today. And before we dive in, we just wanted to introduce ourselves briefly and give a little background on who we are. So I'm Bree, and I'm here with my colleague, Eileen.
Hello.
Hi, Wiley. And we're from the Participant-Centered Design team at SJI, which is also known as Seattle Jobs Initiative. And SJI is a nonprofit. We're located in Seattle, as you can probably tell from our name, but we work nationally and we do a lot of technical assistance work in addition to research and evaluation and running our own direct service programs locally. And a lot of our technical assistant work focuses on SNAP employment and training, or ENT. And you may have heard of us through that since we're partnering with NCAP to help agencies build and grow their SNAP ENT programs. So Eileen and I are on the participant-centered design team, and we work with community-based organizations and government agencies and higher ed institutions to center participants in every aspect of their work. We specialize in applied research and collaborative design, in using data more effectively, especially to identify and address equity gaps. And we're going to touch on all of these topics as we talk about centering participant voices in assessment work today. So we wanted to start off with a couple poll questions to set the stage and to learn more about you and what you're currently doing. So I'm going to share a slide which describes our first poll question, and that is, how do you currently assess the impact of your program or programs? So Haley, if you wouldn't mind popping up that poll so people could respond, that would be great. We've given you some of the more common options. Feel free to check more than one option. You might do in-house assessment and or hire an external evaluator or review program data or talk to participants. So it looks like we have some responses coming in. We'll just give you a few seconds to respond. Okay. A few more trickling in. And I think we can go ahead and end the poll and share the results. Okay, great. So we have a large number of people. Looks like the top two responses were reviewing program data and asking participants to provide feedback, which is wonderful. We want to hear more about what you're doing. And it looks like a little over half of the respondents also do in-house assessments or evaluations, which is wonderful to hear. So hopefully we can share today some practices and options that you can take and adapt and add to what you're already doing. Let us go to the next poll question. And that is, to what extent are you engaging participants in assessing your impact? And take a moment to think about this and rate where you think you are on a scale of 1 to 5, with 1 being to a limited extent and 5 being to a great extent. And I know that we haven't talked yet about what it means and what it looks like to engage participants in assessing your impact, but it's fine for you to use your own perspective on what this means for now. This is really just a reflection question. So it looks like we have some responses trickling in. I'll give you another few seconds to respond. All right, I think we're good and we can end the poll and share the results. All right, so we have some good distribution here, more people kind of in the middle area to a medium extent. It's great to see some fours and even some fives. So wonderful. One thing we wanted to note here is that we haven't worked with or seen a single organization that couldn't be more participant-centered. It's really a continuous practice, and a healthy organization is always evolving its participant-centered practices. So we would love for you to think about today how you might be able to move a little more to the right on this scale, like a quarter point, a half point, a full point or more. And even if you ranked yourself a 5 on the scale, you could still move to the right. And our goal today is really to share with you information and options that can help you do this effectively. So here is our agenda. We're going to briefly talk about why it's important to center participant voices. Then we're going to provide a little more context on this work. And then we'll walk through 4 key steps to doing assessment work in a participant-centered way. Then we'll talk a bit about how to get started, working from where you currently are, and we'll wrap up with a Q&A. So if you have questions during our presentation and while we're sharing, feel free to drop them in the chat and we will answer them during the Q&A. I also wanted to note that some of our slides have a lot of text, and don't worry about reading all of the text on the slides. We're going to be sending them out afterwards, and so you'll have time to read through them later. Okay, so let us move into why it's important to center participant voices. And the first reason is that it's critical to increasing program effectiveness. We've generally seen that the more participant-centered an agency is, the more effective their programs typically are. And that's because there's better alignment between participants' goals and program goals and participants' lives and how services are provided. And the tables on this slide just outline the key differences between more participant-centered agencies on the left, and less participant-centered agencies on the right. And probably one of the biggest differences that we see is that participant-centered agencies are in constant dialogue and collaboration with participants, whereas less participant-centered agencies often make more assumptions about participants, which can lead to less alignment because their assumptions may not always reflect participants' realities. And they may not lead to providing support in a way that actually works for participants. And that can then have impacts on program effectiveness. So to kind of context this and bring it to life, wanted to go through a quick case study together. So we worked with a workforce development agency that was offering an employment and training program, and they wanted to assess their outcomes. They basically wanted to know to what extent their programs were working for participants, and if they, what was working and what wasn't. So they started by looking at their program data, and they saw that they had lower completion rates among the groups they wanted to engage. And this was concerning because there were specific groups and populations in their community that they really wanted to support. I mean, that was a big goal of the program, was to support these certain groups and populations. But these groups were less successful in their programs overall than others. So after reviewing this data, our first step was to get the lay of the land from the perspective of the program staff. And we interviewed them, and they shared reasons as to why they thought people in these specific groups had lower engagement and completion rates. And so here are some of the reasons they shared. You can see they were thinking that maybe they weren't communicating the value of the program and the services that well, or participants weren't understanding it. Maybe they weren't offering the right career paths. And then there were a fair number of people that were thinking, well, we just have people in the program who don't really want to work. Then we talked to participants, and they had a lot to say. And it turned out that by and large, they did want to work, but they had run into process and engagement hurdles and hassle factors and logistical challenges having to do with childcare and transportation, which I'm sure is probably does not come as a surprise to any of you. And even though the agency was offering some supports, they often weren't offered in a way that was easy for participants to take advantage of. And participants also talked about the quality of their interactions with staff and how critical that was to their experience, sometimes even more than the support services they received. So as a result of this work, this agency was able to identify and really illuminate gaps between their assumptions and participant realities. And this was important because it not only allowed them to improve the participant experience once they were aware of these gaps, but it also allowed them to shed light on whether they were actually reducing the inequities that they wanted to reduce. And this is another reason why centering participant voices is so important. It's a key component of advancing equity. Like in order to advance equity, we need to know what participants are experiencing so that we can responsibly address and remove any barriers that they are encountering, barriers that are often creating inequities. And we can do this by ensuring that our programs are designed and run in a way that removes the barriers rather than unintentionally exacerbates them, and by providing specific and tailored resources and supports to participants and people according to their individual needs. And we need to be in communication with them in order to do this. So now I'm going to turn it over to Eileen to provide a little bit more context on this work.
Yeah. So I'll give a little context, as the slide said, for things to kind of be thinking about as we go through the rest of the presentation. Can you go to the next slide, please? Yeah, so kind of defining here, what do we mean then to center participant voices in assessing your impact? And so what we mean is it's intentionally prioritizing participants' authentic input and participation in assessing what effects your program produces and where improvements could be made. So in all that you do to determine the value of your program, it's involving your participants and learning from them. I should go to the next slide. But not all involvement is the same. So this slide attempts to highlight, these steps highlight that there are different degrees and levels of involvement and ownership. And this can apply both to program assessment, but it also could be applied to all aspects of program design and implementation as well. And all of these steps are good things. A lot of times organizations might not have taken any of these steps yet, where they might be communicating with participants, or if they are communicating with participants at all, it might be all one way. The information might be kind of one way. So really any of these steps are a step in the right direction where communication is two-way and participants have influence in decision making. And so kind of the first step would be, where participants provide information about their situations or their opinions on already established processes and practices or on decisions that have already been made. Whereas like the next step, a more active role in assessment might be where participants are involved in developing activities or questions or in collecting and analyzing data. If participants are co-leading, which is the next step, participants might be more involved in the whole process from design to actually acting on assessment results. And they're at the table helping make some key decisions. And then if they're really leading, they have the authority to make those decisions. So we want to recognize that, depending on the context, different levels of involvement may be appropriate at different times, but the goal is to make sure that participants are involved, and not only because they should be a part of decisions and systems that affect them, but also because they're experts and it's critical. Their insight is really critical to understanding what outcomes are and what they should be. So the more you kind of move up these steps, the more you're really practicing that principle and shifting power and acknowledging different forms of expertise. And in this presentation, we're going to be kind of focusing on maybe the first couple steps mostly, but as you build trust with participants and you practice this, you can really grow capacity to expand participant involvement and leadership. And I know that some of you may already be doing this, so we really hope that we have the opportunity to hear what you're doing, and I hope you can find ways to share like what you're doing and how you're doing it with your colleagues. But hopefully all of us can be thinking kind of about where we are now and how we might be moving a little bit further. And so as we go through the rest of this presentation, if you can remember these tiers, as we go through the different steps and think about how participants can and should be involved and to what degree as we're going through the process. Could you go to the next slide? And so just to help you do that, we thought it would be good for you to maybe take a second to think of a program or an area that you might want to assess. And that will really help ground what we're talking about through the rest and hopefully generate some ideas for your organization. I'm going to turn it back over to Bree.
Thanks, Eileen. Okay, let us dive into step 1 of conducting a participant-centered program assessment, and that is planning. Well, actually, I got a little bit ahead of myself. Before we want to talk about step 1, we want to go through briefly all 4 steps, and then we'll dive into planning. So this slide lists the 4 key steps. And as Eileen mentioned, it's important to be thinking about how to make each of these steps participant-centered. And these steps are pretty straightforward. So I just mentioned the first one, which is planning. So figuring out what you actually want to do with your assessment and what you want to learn. Then there's designing. So determining how you're going to get the information and data that will tell you what you want to learn. Then there is going out and actually getting that data and then analyzing it. And finally, reporting and sharing your findings and making improvements based on them. So now let's dive into the first step, the planning step. And to do this, you'll first want to determine your area of focus and what you want to know. So for our purposes today, we're going to focus on participant outcomes and the participant experience. And we'll then want to develop some assessment questions to help us articulate what we want to know and learn about participant outcomes and about the participant experience. So we have some example questions on this slide. There's a range. How did participants experience our programs and services? What would they emphasize and or change? Did they have the effects that we or the effects that participants hoped for? Did they have unforeseen effects? Are some people deriving more benefit than others, and why? And why did we get the results that we did? So questions like this can help illuminate any gaps like the ones that came up in the case study that we went over a little earlier, or highlight things that are working well in the program that might be having a bigger positive impact than we might have realized. So let's touch on how we might do this step in a participant-centered way. So thinking again about the stair-step diagram that Eileen shared and the different levels of participant involvement, you could engage participants directly in the assessment planning process. You may want to ask them what types of questions they think you should be asking in your program assessment and what areas you should be exploring. You'll probably want to explain a little bit and give a little bit of context on what assessment work actually is if you ask those questions. And if you want to know how impactful your program is, you may want to ask participants how they view success. This is a really good question to help shed light on the extent to which there's alignment between your view of success and participants' view of success. So engaging and dialoguing with participants at the outset, as well as throughout their time with you, can help ensure that you're viewing assessment work with a participant-centered lens. So next, you'll want to describe your program and how it's supposed to work. So this can be done simultaneously with developing your assessment questions. You don't have to wait to do it. And in addition to describing your program and how it works, you'll also want to identify and describe how you measure progress and success with an emphasis on what data that you're currently collecting. And this is important because you're going to need information and data to answer your assessment questions. So you'll need to know what data you have available to you and what data you might need to go out and collect. And one way that people often describe their programs is through a logic model. A lot of you may already have logic models, and we don't have a lot of time to go into the details, but basically a logic model depicts how a program is supposed to work and how it brings about change in a simplified way. It usually has 4 or 5 different components. We've listed 4 in the example here. And it tells you first, what you need to put into your program to make it run. So that's the resources and inputs. What activities you'll do to achieve your intended goals. what the outputs or results of these activities are. So for example, like how many of these activities you'll actually do, and then what outcomes you want to produce. In other words, how participants are affected by their participation in the program. And then you typically have indicators. And indicators are markers of accomplishment and progress. They're usually quantitative and numeric, and you can see example types of indicators here at the bottom of the slide. So let's zoom in on indicators because they typically reflect the program data that you're collecting, that you already have, and you may need some of this program data, as I mentioned, to answer your assessment questions. So on this slide, we've listed some example indicators for an employment and training program like SNAP Employment and Training. So just reading off a couple examples, this program might offer job skills training classes. And the intended outcome of these training classes could be that participants have increased job skills. And an indicator of that could be the number or percentage of participants who are passing job skills assessment. And if you want to look at a longer term outcome, we can look at the last outcome on this list, which is that participants have increased and sustainable employment after having received job skills training and employment support. And there are a number of indicators that could reflect progress here, like the number and percent of participants who are still working after a certain number of months, or the average hourly wage of people who became employed, and so on. So listing out your indicators should give you a good sense of how you're measuring success in your program, and it should hopefully align with the type of data that you're collecting. So a few important things though, you do not have to have a logic model, and you do not have to use words like indicators. A logic model is kind of sometimes a rigid format. It may not be the best fit for you. Like instead, you could just write down a description of your program, your goals, how you measure success, and what data you have, and that would be enough. And ideally, if you're in the position of just starting a program, like you're starting, for example, a SNAP E&T program for the first time, you should really plan for program assessment from the very beginning so that you and your partners and stakeholders can align on how to measure impact and effectiveness and make sure that you're collecting the right data that you'll need for your assessment from the very start. So now I'm going to turn it over to Eileen to go over the next 3 steps of the assessment process. We're going to transition screen sharing. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and Eileen's going to share hers.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So now we're into step 2, designing your assessment. So after you and potentially some of your participants have come up with what you want to find out about your program, and you've revisited your mission and what you're trying to do, you'll need to determine what data and information you will need to answer those questions. So there are many forms of information and data that you could collect, you could use. This is a little bit of an overview of kind of giving an idea of what different types of data might be able to help answer. So quantitative data on the right are the things that you can count and measure, and qualitative data are things that are more like perceptions, people's perceptions, thoughts, feelings. Quantitative data is good at sort of answering the what is happening and what's going on, and often at a larger scale. And qualitative data is really helpful in understanding sort of why and how things are happening. It can get a little more depth and nuance than quantitative data can sometimes show. And it also helps understand, norms and assumptions that may be shaping choices and behaviors, and how those might sometimes actually appear in our systems and processes. So for example, if these, taking some of those questions we had before, if these are some of the questions you're wanting to find out, what type of information would we need? So this first one, so how did participants experience our programs and services? So this is largely qualitative, asking people what processes and programs felt like to them, what their opinions were. But you can also quantify some of this data. For example, through something like a survey, you could assign like a scale or a number to certain feelings. For example, we've probably all answered those questions that are like on a scale from 1 to 5. What extent did this program meet your expectations, or something like that? So that's like a way you can sort of quantify that and then, measure and compare more broadly, but you won't get quite the nuance that you might if you were talking to people. So that could be both. The next one is also kind of both. You could look at outcome data, but you also could talk to people and kind of see what that actually looks like and if it's what you think it is. So for the third one, unforeseen effects, that also could be, both. Again, this might be a little heavier actually this time in the quantitative side, because statistical analysis can be quite good at seeing how maybe outcomes are distributed, or things that might not have been you might not have expected. But it also could be determined through learning your participant experiences in detail and the ways that they say that this impacted their lives. The next one, again, might be a little more quantitative, because like I was saying earlier, statistic analysis can be quite good at distribution across participants, and but you also can learn some of that from qualitative work as well. And then finally, the last one might be more qualitative, but you could also draw on quantitative information. So as you can see, a lot of questions actually can be answered in multiple ways. You can use sort of mixed methods, but it might be more appropriate to, depending on what you want to know, to draw a little heavier on one type than the other. So once you decide what data you need, you then determine kind of how you will gather that data. So again, on the right side, we have sort of our quantitative sources, things like your internal program data and potentially statewide wage or demographic data. And on the right, you have some qualitative options that you could use. And again, like surveys we've been talking about as a way to quantify, but also if you ask like more open questions, write in answers, you can get qualitative data as well. Some of these options here are a little more formal, but the point is that there are many options and a lot of less formalized ways to do it that may depend on your context, relationships, or amount of resources that you have. And I also want to point out that this is actually a really good place, another really good place where participants have a lot of knowledge about how to understand their communities and environments, and about what methods might work the best and what would be appropriate. So really, that knowledge is crucial. So this next slide, again, like Bri was saying, this one has a lot of text, so don't worry about reading all of it now. But what I want to point out with this is that different methods or activities might vary in the level of participation possible, but it also depends on the way that you do them. So if you think of the stair steps, this sort of corresponds with the stair steps that I showed earlier. So for example, a survey is different than, for example, a participatory advisory board in what level of participation might be possible, but also an advisory board where participants are giving feedback on decisions that are mostly already determined, versus one where they might be involved in making those decisions, would be quite different. So different, levels of engagement shift both in the methods that you choose, but also how you do them. So that's kind of emphasized in those right columns, where we're focusing a little bit more on the approach rather than the specific activity, to highlight that both the intent and the approach matter. And that's why we have different methods are kind of in different columns here. So the last thing I wanted to show for this step is just an example of how you could maybe go about organizing your data or planning your process. And so you could create a table like this, where you have like your questions on one side, the method you're going to use, and then from whom you need to get that data, or from where you need to get that data. And this just sort of helps you make sure that you're aligning the methods that you choose with the questions that you're asking and making sure that they will answer those questions. So this next step is probably, important to be thinking about, or you do simultaneously with the last one, because while you're choosing methods, you should also be thinking about what methods might be appropriate for who you want to engage. And so in thinking about who you want to engage, it's really important to consider who might be left out of your planning or consideration. Because yes, we want to engage participants, but participants are not, as we know, one cohesive group. So it's important to think about who's in the room and who might not be. So are, the people with sort of the loudest voices, the ones that are there, the ones who are usually active and engaged, the ones who maybe already have relative power. So you want to think about who you might be missing and how to engage them too. And I'll recognize that that's not always easy, and it often takes a lot of intentionality. And because of that, a big part of this is also being really aware of who you are talking to, because you should really try to engage as many people as you can, but you can't always engage everyone that you wanted to. So if you are getting the most vocal and active people, you have to be aware of that, and to make sure that you understand the ways that that might influence the information that you're finding out. So don't be, make sure you're not generalizing to everyone based on that. So this image here, this little image on the right, is kind of trying to visualize that for you. So if that large group of dots is all your participants in your program, and that little group of dots up at the top is who you're talking to, your little group there is, it's a little bit diverse, right? You have some different dots there, but it's definitely not representative of your whole group. So it's just to remind you to keep your limitations in mind, especially when you're collecting data and when you're communicating and applying the results. So step 3 is collecting and analyzing data. And we want to highlight here that being participant-centered is not just involving participants in the assessment or even the methods that you choose, but it's also being careful and thoughtful in how you do your activities. And that's a really crucial part of being participant-centered. So relationship and trust are really important to engaging a diversity of participants. So when you're designing your collection process, your data collection process, make sure that people can participate easily and comfortably. Make sure you're considering power dynamics between, the person who's collecting data and the person sharing the data, and how that, may influence how the person feels or what they feel comfortable saying. It's important to really be clear about what you're doing. So make sure that participants have all the information that they need to decide if they want to participate in your assessment process or not. And this process of making sure that they know everything about the process and how you're going to share data is what we call informed consent. And that's to really emphasize just, that clarity and transparency about what you're doing. And finally, make sure you honor participants' time and the expertise that they're giving you, and offer compensation wherever possible. So once you've gathered your data and you start to analyze it, these are a few tips about how to analyze your data. So quantitative data, it's good practice to disaggregate it. So that means like breaking it down into subcategories based on different population factors, for example, by race or gender, for example, if you can. And then this may help see how your program is potentially impacting people differently, or where unseen bias or inequities might be taking place. And then in qualitative data, you're really looking through what people said and looking for themes and patterns in what people tell you. And when analyzing all of your data, it's really important to invite multiple perspectives into analysis. And this helps avoid bias in interpretation, because again, different people will interpret information differently based on who they are. So this is a really important place for participants again, because they will most likely see things that you didn't and may understand and interpret the data differently based on their experience. And we also wanted to point out just a couple common risks that are really, really easy to make. And that's often sometimes focusing only on information that supports what you wanted to hear, or maybe what you already believe to be true. And that's an easier trap to fall into than you think. And then also, like I mentioned before, make sure you're not generalizing too broadly and keeping in mind where the data came from and what it's saying and what it isn't saying. Okay, so that's step 3. And now step 4. This relates to sharing and making improvements, which some people forget how important this is. You need to be actually using what you're finding. So the first thing is determine how you will share findings with all those people who are interested in the assessment that you're doing. So that's staff, the board, but also especially participants. So think about how you need to communicate your findings to be relevant and accessible for your different audiences. And you may need multiple ways and multiple formats in order to communicate it effectively. And you also want to try to you want to center participant voice in how you communicate your findings as well, not just in the process. So it's helpful to get the perspective of those who shared information with you on how you're communicating it, but also in the story that you're telling, really highlight the experience of people. And that's more than just a few quotes, really center the experience in the story and in the narrative that you give. And the second thing is to commit to taking action and making those participant-centered improvements. So one of the key things to do in order to do that is to really think about use from the very beginning and through the process. So be continually asking yourselves, what can we learn from this? What changes could we make from what we're hearing? And starting with this end in mind will really shape the assessment and really shape how you go about doing it. Secondly, have a process for discussing findings and turning them into action. And this will really help, even if results are maybe not what you anticipated or maybe not even what you wanted to hear. Having a process set in place will make sure that you act appropriately on what you find. Because the goal is really to move, with all of this, the goal is to move from just listening and taking data, but to actually be using it and having consistent action and thoughtful action. So next we're gonna have a little section on how to get started, and I'll let Bree do this.
Thanks, Eileen. Okay, so we have given you a lot of information about assessment, and it may seem like assessment work is a more formal event that you do once a year, every couple of years. And it can be, this is part of it. It's important to take time to thoroughly assess or evaluate your program and services and do a deeper dive. But assessment work shouldn't be a one and done event, and it does not even have to be a big event. Another key facet of assessment work is continuous improvement. And in continuous improvement work, you have the opportunity to add a participant lens to what you're already doing and make improvements incrementally based on that. So we wanted to share some tips on how to do this and how to get started from where you are. So one way to add that participant-centered lens is to make participant engagement an agency priority. That can look like including it in your strategic plan or your goals if you have them, and importantly, allocating resources to participant voice activities, because resources kind of show oftentimes where priorities are. So you do need leadership commitment and involvement for this. And you can also operationalize by integrating participant voices into your daily activities. And this could look like including participant voices in key decisions and initiatives and operations as a standard practice. And then moving further up that stair-step diagram of participant engagement that we talked about earlier, You could also create participant advisory boards. Another important element is making sure everyone has the tools they need and feels comfortable doing this work. So you could provide participant voice training and professional development to staff. And then moving on to the next slide, we have a couple tips and suggestions for this work. The first is to be intentional about taking a participant-centered lens and applying it to your work, and it shouldn't just be an afterthought. Also, a good way to get started is to start small. Again, like it does not have to be this big formal event. So you can ask yourself, what small things can we do based on what we're already doing? And we've included a couple ideas here. You could incorporate short questions or conversations with participants into events or processes that are already taking place, like orientations, the intake process, one-on-one meetings you have with participants and classes. It can be as simple as asking participants what they've learned, what they would still like to learn or do. So a couple simple questions when you see them. You can also set expectations from the very start that you're going to be asking them for some feedback and checking in with them periodically. So they and you get into the mode and kind of into the flow of these types of conversations. And it can just be a quick check-in with them on an ongoing basis. And then you'll want to digest and make sense of and do something with what you're learning from participants, what you're hearing. And a good way to do this is to have dedicated meeting time with your colleagues and your team to compare notes and discuss and make these continuous improvement adjustments based on the feedback and insights and perspectives of participants. And then in order to perpetuate and really sustain this participant-centered lens and this culture, you'll want to share the results or changes that you made with participants and staff and stakeholders. And in this way, you'll be continuously evolving the impact of your program in a participant-centered way. So I think we can move on to the next slide, which is a reflection question. So before we move into the Q&A, we'd love for you to take a moment to think about what you can do or what you have done to incorporate participant voices into your assessment or improvement work. It seemed like from the polls we did at the beginning that many of you are already doing a lot of this work. So we would love to hear what you're doing. I think it would be really beneficial for everybody to hear. So in addition to asking questions, if you have any, feel free to share what you're doing. We can kind of have a Q&A / like sharing discussion session in, I guess, the next, we have about maybe 10 minutes or so for that. So we can move on to the, well, I guess we can keep this reflection question up so people can remember
Either
what
way.
it is. Yeah, and then if you have questions, we can also kind of start the Q&A now. So what we can do is feel free to put any questions or share your answers to this question in the chat, and we will respond. So, and also you can also unmute too, or raise your hand. That works as well. So we can do kind of a hybrid.
Thank you so much, Bree and Eileen. I think while people are maybe chewing on the reflection and their question, I was kind of pondering on something I was hoping that you might be able to shed some light on. So I really appreciate the advancing equity piece of centering participant voices. And I think that that's incredibly important, especially now. And I think I'd like to ask more about being intentional about designing engagement and the participants that you are engaging to give that expertise to agencies to be able to do this work. And I think I was hoping that you might be able to shed some light on this kind of balancing act of trying to amplify the voices of the people that you're serving and also not putting the work into the people that you're serving and really being able to amplify their voices without harboring on their expertise, because as you said, they're experts in these areas, but you don't want to make individuals that you're serving feel like they're the ones doing the work for you. And so I was kind of hoping you might be able to shed some light on that balancing act a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a really important point. And it's also important to keep in mind that participants have really busy lives as well. So finding a way to be dialoguing with them, in a way that works for them and that doesn't cause kind of undue challenge in terms of like time commitment, et cetera, is really important. And so one way, I'll offer like maybe an idea or two, and then Eileen, can turn it over to you if you have any as well. One way is sort of that last slide that we were just going over, where tips where you kind of build it into your program on an ongoing basis, like little questions or dialogue here and there, I think can be really valuable because it's part of the flow of what participants are already doing. Right? Like you can just say, hey, I have a couple questions for you that we'll be asking sort of at the end of every time we meet together. And that's really to help us kind of make sure that we're meeting and kind of meeting what you would like, and also would love to hear what you have to say, because we want to be always making improvements as well. And so, like, if they get kind of used to that, it just becomes a normal piece of what they're doing with you, and it's not onerous or it shouldn't be burdensome, and it shouldn't, and that's helpful for staff as well, right? Because staff are really busy and have so much on their plate. So if it's kind of built into the process in a low touch way, then that can be really helpful. Also, if you're doing something a little more formal and you do want to convene people together to talk or share kind of feedback or co-design for a period of time, doing it like dialoguing with them about what would work well, but also providing compensation for their time and making sure that they have everything they need in order to be able to participate, is really helpful. And I think that also kind of helps make sure that people are able to be compensated for what the expertise that they're providing. I don't
Mhm.
know, Eileen, did you have anything to add?
Those are kind of going to be the things that I was going to highlight too. I really
Mhm.
think that building it into like a daily routine, daily practice, can really reduce some of that burden. And then also like, yeah, recognizing what people are doing and compensating them for that. But yeah, I mean, I think like just the more that you do this and the more that you model that what you're doing with the data and why, like how it's actually making improvements for everyone, I think like that sort of value added that everyone is contributing to can really, also help make sure that this is not just like throwing all the burden on one, one group of people, but that we're all kind of doing this together to make it work, can add, you know, make it not feel like exploitation or extra work. But yeah.
I appreciate that. Thank you so much.
Thanks. Does anybody have any examples that they want to throw in the chat or just let us know about in terms of like what's worked well? Sounds like a lot of you do assessment work or engage participants, and we'd love to share.
I can share something.
That would be great.
I appreciate the last comments you had on feedback from participants because I work for an agency in Central Maine. We are currently in the beginning phases of our 3-year assessment cycle, and we're doing it as a state, the entirety of the state. All of our agencies are working together, and we're partnering with 4 major health groups in the state. So this is a real big process that we're going through. But at the same time, we've put together an internal team we recently, within the last few years, began a whole family services program. So we wanted to measure our success in that. And we really didn't want to start with we do a lot of matrices and things like that to test clients' levels and things, but those always come with a certain bias. And sometimes it's from our perspective that we are deciding what is successful to them. So one of the first things we did as an internal team was decide, how do we put out an assessment that allows our clients or customers to really measure whether they're seeing success or not. And we went through a lot of the steps that you had demonstrated, where we asked both quantitative questions and qualitative questions. We put together a pilot and handpicked 30 families to test the pilot out on, and then got feedback from those families on just the questions themselves on the assessments. tweaked it, and we're going to be sending it out to a larger group of clients. One of the things we discovered during that process was that the qualitative data that we got back in a lot of ways was more valuable to us
Mhm,
than the quantitative data. It really highlighted what things they did and didn't like.
mhm,
But to go back to the concept of overdoing it with clients, we are reaching out to, we're forming focus groups, we're forming targeted focus groups, we're forming low-income focus groups and stakeholder forums, and we're kind of at a point where sometimes it seems as if the same participants are the ones who are willing to talk and want to talk are going to come back over and over again.
mhm.
Your graphic of your dots, your colored dots breaking down who you're reaching or not. So that's one of the challenges. Another challenge is that we are concerned that people are going to get burnt out by receiving. We have the ability to email surveys or email assessments to our clients, and we don't want to overdo it. We don't want them just being like, oh my gosh, these people again,
Mhm,
and they're going to be getting it from health groups. Like I said, we were partnering with
mhm.
hospitals and things like that. So those are considerations that we have. It's good to hear your feedback on them. Also good to know that that the process we're following seems to be in line with what you folks are recommending. It's very helpful.
Thank you so much for sharing.
Yeah.
That was so helpful to hear. And it sounds like you're going about this very thoughtfully, which is really, I think we haven't talked a lot about kind of mindset, although that was sort of folded into everything. But having a really thoughtful, intentional mindset like what you're having really will help create, I think, a strong and positive experience for participants involved, especially thinking about the risks and the concerns that are really valid. So thank you so much for sharing that.
No problem.
So, Haley, I think I'll ask you what you want to do time-wise. We have about 5 minutes left. We can kind of transition out of the Q&A and into wrap-up, or we can spend a minute or two more. It's up to you.
We could do final questions certainly, and then wrap up. Would be great.
All right. Are there any final questions or comments? All right, well, it seems like there aren't any right now. If you have any, I think we can transition to the next slide. Oh, there is one. Do you have any tips to increase engagement? Um, so I'm assuming that this might mean participant engagement. Let me know if that assumption is incorrect or if you want to clarify your question. Yep, okay. Yeah, so I think it depends on what kind of engagement you're going for, like what type of participant feedback or engagement you're looking for. One, like again, kind of a lower touch way to do it, or is to just kind of fold it into meetings that you're already having with participants, and it becomes kind of part of the process. That can be helpful. But if you're thinking about engaging participants in like responding to surveys or participating in events or focus groups, there are a few things to do. A lot of it is in how it's communicated, who's making the ask, what like and dialoguing with participants to craft the activity you're asking them to do in a way that works for them. So maybe seeing if you can do it in asking their feedback on how to put something together that would work for them, and then crafting it in a way that makes it as easy as possible for them to participate. So if they need childcare, transportation support to get there, helping provide that to them, giving them enough time kind of to plan, and the compensation is really key. And like if you want to follow up with us, like Eileen, if you could go to the next slide. I know that those are sort of high level suggestions, but we could kind of show you examples of how we have outreached and how we've communicated to participants, because that might be more helpful. So feel free to reach out to us. Eileen, did you have anything to add?
I think you covered it.
Okay,
For now.
great. All right. Haley, over to you.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you guys so much. If you could advance the slide one, that would be great. Awesome. So thank you all for attending. If you could quickly finish this evaluation. I'll send it in the chat as well, but if it's easier for you to QR code, I also threw it up there. We really appreciate your feedback on all of these webinars. They help us inform the rest of the content that we're going to do for the rest of the year. So really appreciate everyone being here today and being so engaged. And again, Bree and Eileen, thank you so much for your expertise. I just want to plug really fast on the next slide that we have our 2024 annual convention. It is August 28th through the 30th, and then there's a pre-convention available the 26th through the 27th in Seattle, Washington. So very excited about that. I will drop that link in the chat as well. And if anybody is interested in registering or has any questions about that, please feel free to contact me. And my information is on the next slide right here. And we want to thank everyone for attending and being here. And we hope you all have a great week.
Thank you.